The darkness has a way of playing tricks on your mind. When you're out there on patrol at 3 in the morning, every shadow could be an enemy. Every sound could spell danger, and your imagination starts filling in the blanks that your eyes can't see. But what happens when multiple soldiers witness the same impossible thing? What happens when trained military personnel encounter something that defies every rational explanation they've been taught? Tonight, we're diving into the stories that keep veterans awake long after they've returned home. Stories they've shared in hushed voices over beers. Stories that make seasoned warriors question everything they thought they knew about the world. These aren't your typical war stories about firefights or IEDs. These are the encounters that happened in the dead of night, when the veil between our world and something else seemed paper thin. My name is Jake, and for the past 5 years, I've been collecting these accounts from the service members across all branches of the military. What started as casual conversations at VFW halls and military reunions has turned into something much larger. I've spoken with over 200 veterans, and the stories they've shared have left me questioning the very nature of reality itself. Now, before we begin, I want to be clear about something. Every single story you're about to hear has been verified through multiple sources. These aren't urban legends or campfire tales passed down through generations. These are first-hand accounts from credible witnesses, many of whom served multiple deployments and have been decorated for their service. These are men and women who've been trained to observe, to assess threats, and to remain calm under pressure. When they tell you they saw something that shouldn't exist, you listen. What makes these stories even more compelling is that many of them follow similar patterns. Soldiers from different units, different time periods, and different theaters of operation describing encounters that share disturbing similarities. It's as if there's something about military operations, something about being armed and alert in hostile territory, that opens doorways to experiences most civilians will never face. The stories range from the merely unsettling to the absolutely terrifying. Some involve mysterious figures that appear and disappear without explanation. Others describe creatures that seem to defy the laws of physics. And then there are the encounters that are so bizarre, so completely outside our understanding of the natural world, that they've left hardened combat veterans questioning their own sanity. But here's what's truly fascinating about these accounts. They're not isolated incidents. When you start mapping out these encounters geographically and chronologically, patterns begin to emerge. Certain locations seem to be hotspots for unexplained activity. Certain times of night appear to be more conducive to these encounters, and certain types of missions seem to increase the likelihood of witnessing something that simply shouldn't be there. I've spent countless hours cross-referencing these stories, looking for connections, trying to understand what makes these particular moments so special. What I've discovered has kept me awake for weeks. Because when you start connecting the dots, when you start seeing the bigger picture, you realize that these aren't random occurrences. There's something systematic about them, something that suggests we're dealing with phenomena that operate according to rules we don't yet understand. The first story I want to share with you comes from Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, who served 3 tours in Afghanistan between 2008 and 2014. Torres was part of a reconnaissance unit that specialized in long-range patrols in some of the most dangerous terrain in the country. He's received 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart, and his commanding officers describe him as one of the most reliable soldiers they've ever worked with. This is not a man given to flights of fancy or elaborate storytelling. Torres contacted me after hearing about my research through a mutual friend. When we first spoke, he was hesitant to share his experience. He'd kept it to himself for over a decade, afraid that talking about it might damage his reputation or worse, his career. But something about our conversation convinced him that his story needed to be told. It was October 2011, and Torres's unit had been tasked with conducting surveillance on a suspected Taliban supply route in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan. The mission was supposed to last 72 hours, during which they would observe and report on any movement along a particular valley that intelligence suggested was being used to smuggle weapons and fighters across the border from Pakistan. The team consisted of 6 men, all experienced soldiers who'd worked together for months. They'd established their observation post on a ridge overlooking the valley, with good sight lines in all directions and multiple escape routes if things went bad. Everything was textbook perfect. Exactly the kind of mission they'd done dozens of times before. The first 2 days passed without incident. They observed some local foot traffic, a few goat herders moving their animals, nothing that seemed particularly suspicious. The nights were cold and clear, with excellent visibility thanks to their night vision equipment. Standard operating procedure for this type of mission. But on the 3rd night, something changed. Torres was on watch duty, scanning the valley through his scope, when he noticed what appeared to be a light moving along the suspected supply route. At first, he assumed it was a flashlight or possibly a vehicle headlight, though vehicles were rare in that particular terrain. He alerted the rest of his team and began tracking the light's movement. What he saw next defied every assumption he'd made about what was possible in that remote corner of Afghanistan. The light wasn't attached to any vehicle or person he could identify. Instead, it seemed to be floating approximately 6 feet off the ground, moving at a steady pace along the valley floor. Through his night vision scope, Torres could see the terrain clearly, but there was nothing there that could explain the source of the light. He called over his team leader, Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, who confirmed what Torres was seeing. Both men watched as the mysterious light continued its journey through the valley, following the exact route that intelligence had identified as the Taliban supply line. But here's where the story takes an even stranger turn. As they continued to observe, more lights began to appear. First 1, then 3, then what Torres describes as an entire convoy of these floating illuminations moving in perfect formation along the mountain path. Each light maintained the same height above ground, the same steady pace, and the same mysterious absence of any visible source. Rodriguez immediately got on the radio to report what they were observing, but their communications equipment was experiencing interference, unlike anything they'd encountered before. Static filled every frequency, making it impossible to establish contact with their base. This was particularly troubling because their radio had been working perfectly just hours earlier, and the weather conditions were ideal for communication. The lights continued their procession for nearly 40 minutes, during which time all 6 members of Torres's team observed the phenomenon. They took photographs, recorded video, and made detailed notes of everything they witnessed. But when they reviewed their documentation later, they discovered something that chilled them to the bone. None of their equipment had captured anything unusual. The photographs showed only empty valley. The video revealed nothing but darkness and terrain features, and their written observations seemed to describe events that had never occurred. It was as if the lights had existed in some parallel dimension that their eyes could perceive, but their technology could not record. When their communications finally cleared and they were able to contact base, Torres and his team reported the incident in detail. The response they received was immediate and unambiguous. They were to cease all observation activities and return to base for immediate debriefing. No questions, no explanations, just orders to pack up and move out. The debriefing that followed was unlike anything Torres had experienced in his military career. Instead of the usual intelligence officers and commanding staff, they found themselves facing individuals who refused to identify themselves or their agency affiliation. The questioning was intense and methodical. Each team member was separated and interrogated individually about every detail of what they'd observed. The unnamed officials seemed particularly interested in the technological failures, asking repeated questions about the timing of the communication disruptions and the camera malfunctions. What disturbed Torres most was how familiar these officials seemed with similar incidents. They asked specific questions that suggested they'd dealt with comparable situations before. Questions about the height of the lights, their formation patterns, the duration of the sighting. It was clear they had a checklist, a standard protocol for handling exactly this type of encounter. After 12 hours of questioning, Torres and his team were released with explicit instructions never to discuss the incident with anyone. They were told that their mission report would be classified at the highest levels, and that any attempt to share details of what they'd witnessed would result in serious consequences for their military careers and personal lives. But here's what makes the Torres' story so compelling. 3 months later, he encountered another soldier at a different base who approached him with a knowing look and a simple question. "You saw the lights too, didn't you?" This soldier, who Torres had never met before, had experienced an almost identical incident in a completely different region of Afghanistan, complete with the floating illuminations, the communication failures, and the mysterious debriefing by unidentified officials. Over the years, Torres has connected with 17 other service members who've reported similar encounters in various theaters of operation. The details vary, but the core elements remain consistent. Unexplained lights moving in formation, technological equipment failures at crucial moments, and intensive debriefings by officials who seem to know far more about these incidents than they're willing to admit. This pattern of official interest brings us to our second story, shared by Marine Lance Corporal Sarah Mitchell, who served in Iraq during the surge operations of 2007. Mitchell's encounter occurred during what should have been a routine security patrol in the outskirts of Ramadi, but what unfolded that night challenged everything she thought she knew about combat operations. Mitchell's squad had been tasked with conducting a presence patrol through a neighborhood that had seen increased insurgent activity. Intelligence reports suggested that enemy fighters were using the area to stage attacks against coalition forces. So the mission was designed to disrupt their operations and gather information about their movements. The patrol began at midnight, with Mitchell's squad moving through narrow streets lined with traditional Iraqi houses. Most of the local population was asleep, and the neighborhood was eerily quiet except for the occasional barking of stray dogs. Everything seemed normal until they reached an intersection that their maps indicated should lead to the main marketplace. But the intersection wasn't there. Instead, Mitchell and her squad found themselves facing a street that didn't exist on any of their maps or satellite imagery. The architecture was completely different from the surrounding area, with buildings that appeared far older and constructed in a style none of them recognized. The street stretched into darkness beyond the range of their night vision equipment. Mitchell's squad leader, Staff Sergeant Johnson, immediately called for a halt while he consulted their GPS equipment. But every piece of electronic navigation gear they carried showed their location as being in the middle of empty desert, miles from any structures. Their radios produced only static, and their satellite communication equipment couldn't establish a connection with any known networks. The logical response would have been to retrace their steps and find an alternate route. But as the squad began to turn around, they discovered that the street they'd just walked down was no longer there. Behind them stretched the same mysterious thoroughfare they'd found in front of them, extending into darkness in both directions. Mitchell describes the growing sense of panic that gripped her squad as they realized they were trapped in what appeared to be an impossible geographical anomaly. Trained Marines don't panic easily, but finding yourself in a location that shouldn't exist tends to test even the most disciplined military bearing. They decided to proceed down the mysterious street, hoping to find a way back to familiar territory. As they moved deeper into this impossible neighborhood, they began to encounter signs of habitation. Lights flickered in windows of buildings that seemed to shift and change when observed directly. Shadows moved in ways that suggested human activity, but whenever the Marines focused their attention on specific locations, they found only empty structures. The most unsettling aspect of their journey was the sound of footsteps that seemed to echo their own movements. Every step the squad took was accompanied by the sound of other feet, moving in perfect synchronization, but always just out of sight. When they stopped, the phantom footsteps continued for exactly 3 more steps before falling silent. After what felt like hours of walking through this Twilight Zone neighborhood, Mitchell's squad finally emerged onto a street they recognized. Their GPS equipment immediately began functioning normally. Their radios crackled back to life, and they found themselves exactly where their mission plan indicated they should be. It was as if the entire experience had been some kind of elaborate hallucination, except for one crucial detail. When they conducted their post-mission equipment check, they discovered that their patrol had lasted exactly 4 hours and 17 minutes longer than the distance they'd covered should have required. Every member of the squad's watch showed the same discrepancy. They had somehow lost nearly 4.5 hours in a journey that should have taken less than 30 minutes. The official incident report Mitchell filed was met with immediate interest from intelligence officers who seemed far too familiar with similar occurrences. Like Torres's experience, Mitchell found herself subjected to extensive questioning by unidentified officials who appeared to have detailed knowledge of comparable incidents. What connects these stories isn't just their bizarre nature, but the consistent pattern of official response they generate. In every case I've documented, service members who report these encounters find themselves dealing with authorities who seem to be following established protocols for handling the unexplained. This suggests that our military leadership is not only aware of these phenomena, but has developed systematic procedures for managing them. The question that haunts me is what they've learned from decades of these encounters, and why that information remains classified at the highest levels. Our final story comes from Army Ranger Captain David Chen, whose experience in the mountains of Afghanistan represents perhaps the most disturbing encounter I've documented. Chen served 4 tours between 2009 and 2016, leading special operations missions in some of the most dangerous terrain on Earth. His record is impeccable, his psychological evaluations consistently excellent, and his reputation among his peers is beyond reproach. Chen's encounter occurred during a high-value target mission in the Hindu Kush Mountains. His team had been inserted to capture or eliminate a Taliban commander who intelligence indicated was coordinating attacks against coalition forces. The mission required a 3-day movement through extremely difficult terrain to reach the target location. On the second night, while his team was resting in a concealed position, Chen was awakened by his radio operator reporting strange signals on their communication equipment. Instead of normal radio chatter or the expected enemy communications, they were receiving what sounded like conversations in English, but conversations that made no logical sense. The voices were clearly American, discussing military operations, but the details they mentioned didn't correspond to any current missions. They spoke of battles that had never occurred, referenced military units that didn't exist, and described terrain features that weren't present in their operational area. Most disturbing of all, some of the voices belonged to soldiers Chen recognized, soldiers who had been killed in action months earlier. As Chen's team listened to these impossible transmissions, they began to notice that the voices were getting closer. Not closer in terms of radio signal strength, but actually physically approaching their position. Through their night vision equipment, they could see figures moving through the darkness toward their concealed location. The figures appeared to be American soldiers in full combat gear, but their movement patterns were all wrong. They walked with a strange, synchronized gait that no military training teaches. Their equipment seemed to float rather than hang naturally from their bodies. and their faces, when glimpsed through the green glow of night vision, showed expressions of vacant confusion that chilled Chen to his core. Chen made the decision to hold position and observe rather than make contact. His instincts, honed by years of combat experience, told him that these weren't friendly forces despite their appearance. As the mysterious figures passed within meters of his team's hiding spot, Chen could hear their conversation clearly. They were discussing the mission Chen's team was currently conducting, in perfect detail. They knew the target's name, the planned approach route, even the specific equipment Chen's team was carrying. But they spoke about these details as if the mission had already been completed, as if they were recounting events that had occurred in the past. The Phantom soldiers continued their patrol for nearly 2 hours, during which time Chen's team remained perfectly still. Every member of his unit witnessed the encounter, and each man later provided identical accounts of what they observed. When the figures finally disappeared into the darkness, Chen's communication equipment returned to normal function. The mission continued as planned, but Chen couldn't shake the feeling that they were somehow following a script that had been written long before they arrived. Every aspect of the operation unfolded exactly as the Phantom voices had described, down to the smallest tactical details. The target was eliminated, the extraction went smoothly, and the mission was classified as a complete success. But Chen's report of the encounter generated the same pattern of official interest we've seen in every other case. Unidentified officials conducted extensive debriefings, classified his account at levels far above what a simple mission report would warrant, and made it clear that discussing the incident would have serious consequences. What makes Chen's story particularly significant is what he discovered months later, while reviewing casualty reports from his unit's previous deployments. 3 of the voices he'd recognized during that impossible radio transmission belonged to Rangers who had been killed in action during operations in that exact same mountain range. Operations that had occurred over a year before Chen's encounter. These 3 stories represent just a fraction of the accounts I've collected, but they illustrate the most disturbing patterns I've identified. Military personnel operating in combat zones are encountering phenomena that suggest our understanding of reality itself may be fundamentally flawed. Whether these encounters represent interdimensional bleeding, temporal anomalies, or something else entirely, they're happening with enough frequency to warrant official protocols for managing them. The implications are staggering. If our military has developed procedures for handling encounters with the impossible, what does that tell us about the true nature of the world we live in? How many classified files contain reports similar to the ones you've heard tonight? And most importantly, why are these experiences concentrated around military operations? I believe we're dealing with something that responds to specific conditions. Armed personnel in hostile territory, heightened awareness states, life or death situations where the human mind is operating at peak capacity. It's as if these extreme circumstances create windows into realities that normally remain hidden from our perception. The veterans who've shared these stories with me have done so at considerable personal risk. They've trusted me with experiences that could damage their reputations, their careers, and their relationships. But they've also expressed relief at finally being able to speak about encounters that have haunted them for years. If you're a veteran with similar experiences, you're not alone. These encounters are more common than you might think, and they don't make you crazy. They make you human beings who've witnessed something that challenges our most basic assumptions about the nature of existence itself. The darkness holds secrets that few of us are prepared to face, but sometimes, in the depths of night patrols and combat operations, those secrets reveal themselves to those brave enough to look. Tonight, you've heard just a glimpse of what's waiting out there in the shadows, waiting for the next soldier to stumble across the impossible and return forever changed by what they've seen. Stay vigilant, stay questioning, And remember that sometimes the most important battles are fought not against human enemies, but against the limitations of our own understanding of what's truly possible in this strange and mysterious world we call home.